The prairie evening lay hushed, the wide sky soft with the last pale threads of daylight. Dust hung low, stirred by no more than a weary breeze, and the land seemed to wait for nightfall in its patient silence. A cabin stood apart from the town, its roof patched in places, its chimney breathing a thin line of smoke. Inside, a young man of 26 sat alone at his wooden table, hands rough from work, his supper little more than bread and beans. His name was Caleb Rawlins, and though his body bore the strength of a rancher, his eyes carried a solitude older than his years. He had long made peace with silence. The world had taught him not to expect much beyond cattle, fences, and the slow grind of survival. But that night, silence broke with the faintest sound, a small fist upon his door. 3 knocks, timid yet insistent, like the heartbeat of someone who had nowhere else to go. Caleb frowned, pushing back his chair. He wasn't a man who often welcomed visitors, not at dusk, not when the prairie shadows grew long. Yet something in the rhythm of that knock unsettled him. He unlatched the door, and in the golden spill of lantern light stood 2 children. The elder, a girl of 6, barefoot and thin, her calico dress stained with dust. She clutched the hand of a boy no older than 3, his cheeks smeared with tears, his small frame trembling in the cool air. Their eyes lifted to Caleb's with the kind of fear only the rejected carry. The girl's voice, steady though her lip quivered, broke the silence. "Mr. Mama locked the door. Said we ain't her blood. We got no place." The words struck Caleb like a shot. For a moment, he only stared, hand gripping the doorframe, feeling the rough would bite into his palm. He saw the dirt on their feet, the way the boy pressed his face into his sister's side, the defiance in her tiny chin as she dared to speak truth to a stranger. He crouched down, slow and careful, so his eyes met hers on even ground. The lantern glow caught the lines of weariness in his face, but also the flicker of something softer, something he had nearly forgotten he carried. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice low as a prairie hymn. "Anime," she said, squeezing her brother's hand. "This here's Josiah." Caleb let the names rest on his tongue. He had no business with children, no room for their need in a life already pared to bone. Yet he could not look away. He brushed a speck of dust from Josiah's tangled hair, his calloused fingers strangely gentle. "You been walkin' long?" "Since sundown," Anime answered. "Didn't know where else to go." Caleb's gaze shifted to the open dark behind them, the long road that led back to town. He thought of the stepmother who had cast them out, words like stones thrown at the tender flesh of children. His chest tightened with a memory he had long buried, of being unwanted himself, shuffled between kin who saw him as duty more than son. He drew a breath, the weight of decision pressing heavy. A man alone could survive on silence and bread. But what of 2 small souls, turned away at the door of the world? "Blood don't make a family, little one," he whispered, more to himself than them. Then louder, with a resolve that surprised him, "You're my heart now." Anime's eyes widened, as if she had not expected kindness to answer her knock. Josiah whimpered softly, tugging at her hand, but she steadied him with a nod. Caleb pushed the door wide. "Come inside. Night's colder than it looks." The children stepped hesitantly over the threshold, their small shadows stretching long across the wooden floor. Caleb shut the door behind them, and for the first time in years, the cabin no longer felt hollow. He guided them toward the table, setting out bread and beans though it meant less for him. Anime whispered thanks before tearing the bread in half, giving the larger piece to her brother. Caleb watched, something tightening in his throat. He saw in her the makings of someone far too young forced to be mother. He saw in Josiah the wide-eyed fear of a boy already learning the world could turn cruel. And in himself, he felt the stirrings of a choice that would alter every day to come. As the children ate in silence, the lantern flame flickered against the walls, casting shapes that looked, for a fleeting moment, like a family gathered. Caleb leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, heart unsettled yet alive. He knew what the town would say. He knew what burdens might follow. But as Anime's eyes lifted toward him, cautious yet shining with the faintest trust, he felt a weight settle in his chest that was not burden, but calling. Outside, the prairie wind carried the last of daylight into night. Inside, A man who had sworn himself to loneliness found 2 reasons to open his door. And as the flame dimmed low, Annie Mae's small voice whispered across the quiet. "You ain't gonna send us away, are you, mister?" Caleb did not answer at once. He only reached across the table, resting his rough hand gently over hers, as if to anchor them both. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of all the choices yet to be made, and of a love beginning to take root, fragile as a seed in dust, daring to believe it might grow. The cabin awoke differently now. Morning light spilled through the cracks in the shutters, landing on 2 small shapes curled beneath quilts too large for them. Caleb Rollins, once used to rising to silence, now woke to the sound of breathing not his own. At first it startled him, those soft, uneven breaths of children learning to trust new walls, but soon he found himself listening with a strange peace, as though the house itself had grown a heartbeat. He had set a cot by the hearth, yet the children refused it, preferring the floor close together, Annie Mae's arm always draped across her brother. They reminded Caleb of colts in a storm, thin, skittish, but clinging to one another for warmth. He had left a lantern burning low through the night, remembering what it felt like to wake in the dark with no hand to hold. Life in the cabin bent to their presence, awkward at first, then slowly finding shape. Caleb had lived lean, bread, beans, and coffee enough to keep a man upright, but now there were little mouths to feed, and he found himself learning the measurements of care. Annie Mae helped where she could, sweeping with a broom longer than her small frame, tugging a stool toward the table to reach plates. Josiah followed behind, dragging a tin cup across the floor, the sound sharp but oddly welcome in a house once hushed as a grave. Caleb never thought himself patient, but the sight of Josiah spilling milk, or Annie Mae humming while she mended a tear with crooked stitches, stirred something gentler than he knew he owned. He caught himself softening his tread across the floor, speaking lower, moving slower, as though afraid to break the delicate rhythm of their new life. Still, doubts gnawed. He was a rancher with calloused hands and debts unpaid, a man who had learned to endure loneliness because it was cheaper than hope. Raising children was work of another kind, a labor of the heart, and Caleb feared he might not have the tools for it. One evening, when the children slept and the fire dimmed, he sat at the table with his head bowed. He thought of men he had known, men who built fences straight and strong but never lifted a hand to comfort their kin. He wondered if he was cut from the same cloth. The next Sunday, he carried the children into town. Dust rose around their boots as they walked the road, Annie Mae holding his hand tightly, Josiah perched against his hip. The church bell tolled slow, calling the scattered faithful. Inside, the preacher's voice rang against wooden walls, quoting from Proverbs, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Caleb heard the words as if they were aimed square at his chest, heavier than any yoke. Annie Mae tilted her head, listening, her wide eyes tracing the stained glass that caught the morning sun. Josiah, restless, tugged at Caleb's sleeve until Caleb whispered, "Shoot, son," surprising himself with the word. It lodged in his throat, half frightening, half true. After service, townsfolk watched. A storekeeper raised a brow, muttering about mouths too many for a man alone. A woman whispered, "Ain't his kin." The words slid like knives through the air, sharp enough for Annie Mae to hear. That night, as Caleb mended a harness by lamplight, she asked him quietly, "Are we your problem, mister?" He set down the leather, heart thudding. Her face was small and solemn, her voice steady though her eyes shone with unspilled tears. Caleb drew a slow breath, then answered, each word chosen as carefully as a nail set to wood. "No, darlin'. You're my answer." Something shifted in that moment. Annie Mae's shoulders eased, and she leaned against him, silent but sure. Josiah climbed into his lap, pressing his face to Caleb's chest. The rancher sat frozen, his arms instinctively circling them both, and in that fragile circle he felt the house itself settle into a new shape. Days folded into weeks. Caleb began carving scraps of wood by the hearth, his knife tracing shapes late into the night. By winter's first frost, 2 small horses stood upon the table, rough but recognizable. Annie Mae gasped when she saw them, clutching one close. Josiah toddled about, his horse clutched upside down, proud as a king. The cabin walls bore witness to this slow weaving of family. The silence that once cloaked the place now carried a softer note, the scrape of crayons on wood, the whisper of a lullaby, the sudden laughter of a boy discovering his own shadow. Caleb no longer ate alone. He no longer prayed only for endurance. Yet in quiet hours, shadows of doubt still lingered. He could feed them, shelter them, even love them, but what would the world say? What claim could he make when the law, or their stepmother, came knocking? He had taken them in by choice, but choice alone might not hold against blood and paper. One night, as snow fell lightly against the shutters, Annie Mae laid her carved horse on the table and whispered, "Paul keep us, won't he?" Caleb looked at her, his heart caught between fear and fierce resolve. The fire hissed, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and Caleb realized the silence he had once lived by could no longer protect him. The question was no longer whether he could keep them alive, but whether he could keep them safe from the world beyond his door. By spring, the children had become as much a part of Caleb Rawlins' days as the rising of the sun. He no longer marked the hours by the toll of the church bell or the creak of the windmill, but by Annie Mae's voice calling Josiah in for supper, by the patter of small feet across the porch, by the sound of laughter where silence once held sway. Yet the world beyond his cabin did not share his quiet acceptance. Town has a way of watching and of whispering, and the prairie carried rumor like dry grass carries fire. The first sting came at the general store. Caleb led Annie Mae and Josiah by the hand, guiding them between barrels of flour and stacked bolts of cloth. Annie Mae carried her wooden horse tucked tight beneath her arm, as if to prove she belonged somewhere. The storekeeper, a man with thin lips and sharper eyes, leaned over the counter. "Caleb," he drawled, "you sure you want to saddle yourself with two mouths that ain't yours? Orphanage in Abilene takes in strays, you know. Might be easier all around." Caleb's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, Annie Mae's fingers dug into his hand. Her chin lifted, small but fierce. The storekeeper caught the fire in her gaze and turned back to his ledger, muttering. Caleb said nothing then, but the words followed them home like burrs clinging to wool. At church the next week, it was no better. A woman in a lace bonnet whispered too loudly to her neighbor, "Shame, him raising young uns that don't belong. Ain't right, a man alone keeping children that way." The murmur carried, and Annie Mae's face paled. She tugged at Caleb's sleeve, whispering as they left the pew, "Are we your problem, mister?" Caleb stopped in the aisle, heat rising in his chest. He knelt so his eyes met hers, the hush of the congregation pressing close around them. His hand cupped her cheek, rough thumb brushing away the sting of doubt. "No, darlin'," he said, voice steady as a prayer. "You're my answer." The words settled like stones in the silence, heavy yet immovable. Annie Mae's eyes brimmed but did not spill. She only nodded and clung tighter to his hand. Caleb rose, leading them past the stairs, the weight of judgment pressing on his shoulders like another man's saddle. But inside him, a fire had been lit. That evening, he sat long after supper with the children asleep near the hearth, listening to the wind rake against the shutters. He thought of the preacher's verse, "Train up a child," and wondered what road he was walking. Raising cattle, fixing fences, those were labors he knew. But shaping the hearts of two children cast off by blood? That was a calling he had never sought, yet one he could not abandon. In the weeks that followed, whispers grew bolder. A ranch hand at the livery muttered, "Mark my words, that man'll ruin himself with other folks' burdens." A neighbor shook his head when Caleb passed with the children in the wagon. "Ain't his responsibility," he said, as though the words themselves could carve the ties between them. Caleb bore it all in silence, but each murmur cut deeper, sharpening the question already gnawing in his chest. Was he enough? One late afternoon, Annie Mae drew in the dirt outside the barn, Josiah at her side. She scratched shapes with a stick, 3 figures, hand in hand, beneath a house with smoke curling from its chimney. Caleb stood watching, throat thick. Annie Mae looked up, catching his gaze. "That's us," she said softly. "Our house. Our family." Caleb swallowed hard. His voice hushed when it came. "That's right, little one. That's us." He crouched, adding with the toe of his boot another line of smoke rising higher. The children laughed, proud of their picture. Yet inside, Caleb felt the ground shifting. What he claimed with them in dirt might one day be tested in stone. At Sunday supper in town, the trial of whispers sharpened. Caleb entered with Annie Mae and Josiah at either side, their small hands clutching his. Conversation dimmed as they passed, eyes following. A man coughed, a woman pressed her lips tight. But Caleb held his head steady, guiding the children to the table as though their place had been waiting. He bowed his head over the meal, his voice clear though his heart shook. Bless this food, and bless this home, whether made of wood or flesh. Amen. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the scrape of cutlery. Yet something in that defiance, quiet and unadorned, marked a line that could not be crossed. For Annie Mae leaned close, her voice so soft he nearly missed it. "Pa," she whispered, the word tasting like hope on her tongue. Caleb froze, the sound of it ringing louder than any accusation. He turned to her, eyes burning with the weight of what had just been given. Josiah echoed clumsily, "Pa," pressing his cheek to Caleb's arm. The rancher bowed his head, unable to speak. The whispers had not ceased. They never would. But in that fragile chorus of two small voices, Caleb heard a truth stronger than judgment. He belonged to them, and they to him, no matter the world's reckonings. Outside, the bell tolled for evening, calling the town to its night. Inside, Caleb sat between two children who had chosen him with a word. And though the room still brimmed with disapproval, he felt the stirrings of a different battle ahead, the kind not fought with fists or guns, but with love claimed in the face of doubt. Winter came with quiet force, pressing its cold palms against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters, whitening the ground. Caleb Rollins stacked firewood high, his breath clouding in the brittle air, while inside Annie Mae and Josiah huddled near the hearth, their laughter rising like sparks. The cabin, once spare and hollow, now bore the scent of stew simmering low, and the sound of children filling spaces silence had long claimed. Caleb learned the rhythms of fatherhood in the glow of firelight. He tucked quilts closer around small shoulders, traced the fevered lines of Josiah's brow when a cough rattled him, and steadied Annie Mae's trembling hands when she tried to sew buttons with clumsy thread. His calloused palms, meant for reins and rope, grew skilled in gentler labors, mending, stirring, comforting. It startled him how natural it began to feel, how each act of care stitched itself into his being. Yet with comfort came fear. Caleb knew the gossip had not ceased. Every trip into town brought sidelong looks, mutters that coiled like smoke. "Man's got no claim," one rancher whispered as he passed. "Law'll take those young uns one day." The words chased him back across the frozen prairie, clinging heavier than snow. One night, after supper, the children dozed by the fire, their wooden horses cradled against their chests. Caleb sat in his chair, shadows deepening across his face, humming a hymn his mother once sang. The melody cracked with disuse, yet the sound soothed. Annie Mae stirred, her eyes heavy but listening. "Sing it again, Pa," she murmured, the words slipping from her lips as though it belonged there. Caleb's throat tightened. He sang once more, his voice low, the words carrying memory and promise in equal measure. When silence fell, Josiah, half asleep, clutched Caleb's sleeve. "Don't go away, Pa," he whispered, his small voice fragile as frost. Caleb froze, staring into the fire as if it held an answer. He remembered the night his own father died, the way kin shuffled him from house to house, no anchor, no belonging. He remembered the hollow ache of waiting for someone to stay. And now, in the quiet plea of a child, he heard the echo of his own boyhood. He leaned forward, resting a hand on Josiah's back. "I ain't going anywhere, son," he whispered, though part of him trembled at the weight of the vow. For promises in the West were not made lightly. They bound a man tighter than rope, and this one bound him not only to the children, but against a world that might yet try to take them. Later that night, when both were asleep, Caleb knelt by the fire, his hands clasped tight. His prayer was not polished like the preacher's. It was raw, stumbling, but true. "Lord, give me strength," he murmured. "Not for me, but for them. Let me stand where others failed. Let me be the man they can call father without fear." The fire hissed softly, sparks rising as if the heavens themselves bore witness. Days passed, marked by snowstorms and small mercies. Annie Mae began to laugh more freely, her shoulders less weighed by suspicion. Josiah followed Caleb about the barn, mimicking his every move, dragging a rope too heavy for him yet grinning all the while. In those moments Caleb felt whole, as if the jagged pieces of his solitude had been fitted into place. But shadows persisted. One evening, while mending a harness, Caleb overheard voices outside the cabin, two men riding past on the road. "Won't last long," one said. "Law don't favor a man raising young uns that ain't his." Their laughter faded into the night, but the words remained. Caleb sat stiff at the table, knife paused in his hand, fear pressing against his ribs like a blade. He looked at the children, asleep in their quilts, unaware of the storm gathering beyond their small world. He rose and added wood to the fire, watching the flames climb. The glow caught Anime's face, soft with trust. Caleb's chest ached with the knowledge that love alone might not be enough to keep them safe. He thought of papers, of courts, of a stepmother who had cast them aside but could return with sharpened claim. His resolve hardened in the glow of that fire. He would not let them be torn from him, no matter what law or gossip decreed. The snow deepened outside, muting the world in white. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, with fragile promises, with a love that had grown not in sudden blaze but in steady flame. Caleb watched over the children as though his gaze itself could shield them. The firelight painted him in gold and shadow, a man caught between doubt and devotion. Then Anime stirred in her sleep, whispering words that pierced the quiet like a bell. "Don't let him take us, Pa." Caleb's heart clenched. He knew then that the children, too, had heard the whispers, had carried them into their dreams. The battle was no longer only in his chest. It had crept into theirs. He sat straighter, fists clenched on his knees, eyes fixed on the fire that refused to die. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, but inside Caleb Rawlins made a vow unspoken yet iron-strong. If the world came knocking to claim what was his, it would not find him unprepared. Spring thawed the prairie, softening the hard crust of winter, but in Caleb Rawlins' chest, unease lay heavy as stone. Whispers had thickened through town, no longer just mutters behind hands, but questions carried to the ears of the law. Word spread that the stepmother who cast the children out had returned, bitter and grasping, claiming she had rights still. By the time the sheriff rode to Caleb's gate, the matter had already outgrown rumor. "You'll need to come before the judge," the sheriff said, eyes uneasy beneath the brim of his hat. "Woman says they're not yours to keep." Caleb nodded, though the words struck like blows. Behind him, Anime clutched Josiah's hand, her face pale, her wooden horse pressed tight to her chest. Caleb rested a hand on her shoulder, steadying her though his own knees felt weak. He had known this moment might come, but knowing did not soften its weight. The hearing was held in the town hall, its walls bare but for a flag and a cross. Townsfolk crowded the benches, drawn by curiosity as much as judgment. The stepmother sat stiff in her chair, lips pursed, her voice sharp when she spoke of obligation, of rightful place. "They ain't his kin," she declared. "Law should put them where they belong." The judge, a man gray with years, turned to Caleb. "Mr. Rawlins, the claim stands that you hold no blood tie to these children. Why do you insist they remain with you?" The room hushed, all eyes upon him. Caleb stood, hands rough and scarred, his voice low but steady. "Kin's not just blood," he said. "Kin's who you feed when they're hungry, who you hold when they cry, who you rise early and work late for without complaint. I didn't ask for them to come to my door, but when they did, I saw the Lord's answer to a prayer I didn't know I'd prayed. They're mine, not by blood, but by choice. And I'll stand by that choice." The words hung heavy, but the silence that followed was broken not by the judge, but by Anime. She rose from the bench, her small hands trembling yet her chin lifted high. "He's our Pa," she said, her voice quivering but clear. "Blood or no blood. He keeps us safe. He loves us. Please don't take us away." Gasps rippled through the hall. Some turned their heads, ashamed of earlier whispers. The stepmother's mouth tightened, but her eyes faltered against the child's steady gaze. Josiah, too young for speeches, climbed onto Caleb's knee and wrapped his arms around his neck, clinging as though to anchor himself against the storm. The judge leaned back, eyes softened, hands folded atop the bench. For a long moment, he studied the man and the children, the hush so deep the creak of the rafters seemed loud. Then he spoke, voice grave yet gentle. "The frontier is harsh. Children need not only blood, but care. Mr. Rollins, by your word and their own, you have given both. The court grants you guardianship. May God grant you strength to bear it well. Relief washed through Caleb, so fierce it left him trembling. Annie Mae buried her face against his side, sobbing in silent release. Josiah laughed, a sound bright as spring water, not understanding all but sensing the victory. Around them, townsfolk shifted, some nodding with newfound respect, others quiet in the face of mercy revealed. That night, back at the cabin, Caleb set 2 carved horses at the children's bedside, his gift made long ago now given new meaning. Annie Mae cradled hers, whispering, "You kept us, Pa." Josiah held his close, already drifting to sleep. Caleb stood in the doorway, lantern in hand, watching the rise and fall of their small breaths. He felt the weight of the day pressing him down, but beneath it, a steadier strength. He had spoken truth not just to a judge, but to himself. He was no longer a man defined by solitude, but a father shaped by choice. The cabin no longer echoed with silence. It pulsed with the life he had sworn to protect. He stepped outside, lantern lights spilling across the porch. The prairie stretched vast and dark, the stars endless above. Wind rustled through the grass, carrying the faint scent of thawing earth. Caleb drew a breath deep into his chest, steady and sure. Behind him, Annie Mae's voice carried through the open door, soft as a prayer. "Good night, Pa." Caleb closed his eyes, letting the word settle into him, sealing itself like a brand upon his soul. When he opened them again, the prairie no longer looked empty. It looked like home. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.